What is up, everyone? Randomodium here, and this is my updated guide on how you can find the perfect champion for you in League of Legends. This is the third year that I'm doing this video, and I'm really excited for this video because it is definitely the best version of this video that I've ever made, and this may be the best video that I've ever created. I am dedicating this video to my dad, who passed away on November 5th, 2018. My dad had a profound impact on my life, and his wisdom has helped me indirectly shape this channel in many ways. I love you, Dad. So, the whole point of this video is to help you figure out which champion or champions are right for you in League of Legends. League has over 140 champions, so trying to figure out who to play can be an extremely daunting task for new players or veterans alike. The way I'm going to help you figure out which champions are right for you is I'm going to break down all of the champions into 13 subclasses based on their attributes. I'll help you identify which subclasses you would enjoy most based on what attributes you prioritize. Once your ideal subclasses are identified, I'll further break down each subclass to help you find the exact champion or champions you are looking for. We're also going to cover all of the pros and cons for each of the subclasses, discuss how each subclass relate to one another, and really define what makes each subclass unique. The important thing to remember in all of this is that no champion is amazing at everything. Every champion has trade-offs. So not only is it important that you identify which attributes are most important to you, but you also need to identify what you're willing to sacrifice in order for your champion to be superior in certain areas. There are 7 main classes: Slayers, Fighters, Tanks, Controllers, Mages, Marksmen, and Specialists. The classes are oriented around a pentagon, and as you can see, the colors from one class bleed into the colors of the next class. The reason for this is that all of the classes are on a spectrum, and the lines are frequently blurred where one class ends and another begins. Marksmen and Specialists are a bit special in this regard. These classes don't fall on the spectrum because each of them is incredibly diverse. I'm going to talk about Marksmen and Specialists in a bit, but for now I want to focus on the other 5 classes. The classes are oriented around the pentagon to show which classes they are most similar to, not to show which classes they counter. For example, the pentagon indicates that the fighters are most similar to the slayers and tank classes, not that they counter mages and controllers. Each of the classes is pretty self-explanatory. Slayers are damage-focused melee champions, fighters are melee champions who are a mix of damage and tankiness, tanks are the champions with the best defenses in the game, controllers are more crowd control oriented or supportive spellcasters, mages are more damage oriented spellcasters, marksmen are ranged damage dealers, and specialists are champions who don't fit into really any of the other classes. Within each of these classes are offensive and defensive subclasses. Offensive subclasses are great at starting fights, chunking out enemies from long distances, or deleting enemies off the map with a single combo. Defensive subclasses are amazing at finishing fights. They're great when the enemy team tries to engage onto them, either because they have great 1v2 potential or they have great ways to peel enemies off of their allies. The offensive subclasses are the subclasses closest to the outer edge of the pentagon and are assassins, divers, vanguards, catchers, artillery mages, and burst mages. The defensive subclasses are the subclasses closest to the center of the pentagon and are skirmishers, juggernauts, wardens, enchanters, and battle mages. Not only do the offensive and defensive subclasses within each class have a lot in common, offensive and defensive subclasses between adjacent classes also have a lot in common as well. For example, divers have a lot in common with assassins and vanguards. That said, there are some exceptions to the rule with this spectrum of classes. For example, there are a few divers who are very similar to the skirmisher class, and there are a few battle mages who are very similar to the juggernaut class. Overall, this concept is pretty solid though, and it's really useful to visualize how each of the classes are interconnected. Another extremely important aspect of classes and subclasses is that what class and subclass a champion belongs to does not change if they build different items or they take different runes. What subclass a champion belongs to is determined only by the champion's kit and is an intrinsic part of the champion that cannot be changed. For example, if you build a diver with all damage items, that does not make them an assassin. Likewise, if you build a diver with all tank items, that does not make them a vanguard. A diver is a diver regardless of what items you build or what runes you take. Within the Slayer class, there are two subclasses, Assassins and Skirmishers. Assassins are masters of burst damage and mobility, but have virtually no defensive tools or crowd control. Skirmishers are unparalleled duelists who have a good blend of damage and mobility. Within the fighter class, we have two subclasses, Divers and Juggernauts. Divers have superior mobility and crowd control, while Juggernauts have increased tankiness and damage. Tanks also have two subclasses, Vanguards and Wardens. Vanguards have superior mobility to initiate team fights, while Wardens have superior utility to keep allies alive. Controllers are separated into Catchers and Enchanters. Catchers focus on punishing mispositioned enemies with powerful crowd control, while Enchanters focus on buffing allies and keeping enemies away. Mages actually have three subclasses, Artillery Mages, Burst Mages, and Battle Mages. Artillery Mages are longer range, while Burst Mages typically have slightly more crowd control or more burst damage. Battle Mages are shorter range than Artillery Mages or Burst Mages, but have extremely high damage and potent crowd control if you enter their threat area. Like I said earlier, Marksmen and Specialists are a bit special. Those classes are so diverse that each of them could have their own spectrum. For Marksmen, we have Marksmen that deal physical damage, we have Marksmen who deal magic damage, we have Marksmen who deal hybrid damage, Marksmen who rely on auto attacks, Marksmen who rely on spells, Marksmen with mobility, Marksmen with utility, Marksmen who are more duelists, Marksmen who are more team fighters, and Marksmen who are more assassins. For Specialists, it's a similar story. We have Specialists who focus on AoE damage. We have Specialists who are incredibly tanky. We have Specialists who are more like Marksmen. We have Specialists who are more like Assassins or Skirmishers. And we even have Specialists with multiple forms whose subclass changes depending on which form they are in. We'll talk about each subclass in more detail once we figure out which subclasses are best for you. Each subclass is made up of 5 attributes: damage, toughness, crowd control, mobility, and utility. The way we're going to determine the best subclass for you is finding out what things you prioritize in a champion and then matching the right subclass to you. Think of it like building a character in a role-playing game like Dungeons & Dragons or Dark Souls. You only have so many attribute points to distribute, so you're going to need to make some tough choices about what is most important and which attributes you're willing to sacrifice a bit. Unfortunately, there's no charisma attribute in League of Legends. Put bluntly, for every attribute where your champion is above average, you should also expect that they have an attribute where they are average or below average. My best advice to you in determining where your attribute priorities should be is to think about what type of characters you identify with most in video games, movies, and books. Are you more of a warrior who fearlessly charges into battle, or are you a clever scout who skirts around the edges of the battle waiting for an opportune time to strike? Are you someone who more values compassion and prefers helping allies rather than hurting enemies? Are you the type that likes to rain down destruction with powerful spells or ranged weapons? There is no right answer to these questions. You have to determine what is ultimately most interesting to you. Each of the attributes has its own spectrum. In addition to prioritizing the importance of each attribute, you must also decide for each attribute which side of the spectrum you prefer, or if you prefer to be more in the middle. Once you prioritize each attribute and decide where you want to fall on the spectrum for each attribute, we can determine which class is best for you. For damage, there is DPS and burst damage. Burst damage is better for picking off lone opponents and is very effective against squishy opponents, while DPS is better for team fighting, especially if the fight goes on for a longer period of time or you're against multiple tanks. For toughness, there's mitigation and sustain. Mitigation is the negation of damage in the form of shields or resistances. Mitigation is highly effective against burst damage. Sustain is the healing of damage either through abilities or lifesteal. Sustain is highly effective against DPS damage. Crowd control is anything that negatively affects enemies that isn't damage. For crowd control, there are 2 types, soft and hard. Hard crowd control is any crowd control which prevents movement, though many forms of hard crowd control prevent any action at all. Soft crowd control includes things like slows, blinds, and silences that still allow the target to move, but hampers them in some other way. For mobility, there is engage and reposition. Engages are typically long-range dashes or blinks designed to initiate a fight that typically have longer cooldowns. Reposition abilities are either short dashes or movement speed increases that allow a champion to quickly move to a more favorable position. Utility is positive effects that you can cast on yourself or your allies to make them stronger. For utility, there is defensive utility and offensive utility. Defensive utility are spells to help keep your allies alive, such as shields, heals, or bonuses to resistances. Offensive utility are spells that increase the offensive capabilities of your allies, such as damage bonuses, attack speed buffs, or movement speed buffs. What I need you to do is prioritize each attribute from most important to least important, and determine where on each attribute spectrum you belong. You can do this on paper, or if you'd like, I've developed an Excel sheet that you can fill out, which will figure out which subclasses most closely match your desired attributes. The link to that Google Sheet can be found in the video description below. You can also download the Google Sheet if there are multiple people trying to use it at the same time. Alternatively, just write down your attribute priorities, and as we go through each attribute, make a note of which classes match your desired attributes the most. Real quick, I want to go over the Excel sheet that I've made to help you guys. In order to figure out what subclasses are best for you, you'll need to fill out the 10 boxes that have a black border around them. If you mess with any of the other cells, you might break the calculator, so please only edit the 10 cells with a black border around them. So for me, I favor toughness and mobility, so I'm going to put a 5 for toughness and a 4 for mobility. Crowd control and damage are equally important to me, so I'll put a 3 for both of those. Finally, utility isn't very important to me, so I'll put a 1 for that. As you can see, the classes are updating in real time, so you can see how your answers change the outcome. Now I have to put where I am on the spectrum for each attribute. DPS is slightly more important to me than burst, so I'll put a 3 for DPS, and you'll see that it automatically updates burst to a 2. For toughness, I slightly favor sustain over mitigation, so I'll put a 2 in mitigation, and sustain will automatically update to a 3. For crowd control, I favor hard over soft, so I'll put a 1 in soft crowd control, and hard control will automatically change to a 4. For mobility, I favor engage over reposition, so if I put a 4 in engage, reposition automatically updates to a 1. Finally, for utility, I favor defensive slightly more than offensive, so I'll put a 3 in defensive utility, and then offensive utility will automatically update to a 2. This gives my top 3 classes as Divers, Vanguards, and Wardens, which does match my champion pool very well. On the right side of the sheet, you can see how you've scored for every single class. For example, my number 4 and number 5 classes were Skirmishers and Juggernauts, and my lowest ranked classes were Enchanters and Marksmen. This Excel sheet is definitely still a work in progress, so if you get some weird results, please take a screenshot of what you got and leave a comment. If you want to use this Excel sheet, it's free to do so, and if you don't, then just write down your priorities on paper and we'll go through the process manually. If you already know what classes you prefer, there are timestamps in the video description, and you can skip to those sections in the video. On each attribute graph, each subclass is going to be abbreviated based off the first 3 letters of the subclass and is colored based on what class they fall under. For example, the Assassin subclass will be abbreviated as ASS because those are the first 3 letters of Assassin, and also because you're an ass if you main Assassins. Furthermore, you can see that both the Assassins and Skirmishers are in red because they both fall under the Slayer class. This table is a very simplified version of the graphs that we're going to go over next. The point of this table is to give you a quick reference so you can see initially which classes you may be interested in. The other point of this table is to show you that you can't have a class that's great at everything. As you can see from the table, each class only has 2 or 3 attributes that they're considered above average in, and 2 or 3 attributes where they're considered average or below average in. Keep this in mind as we go through each attribute, and always remember what your priorities are. I also got some feedback that this graphic was very difficult for people with color blindness to understand. So this year I've added the rank in parentheses for those of you who are colorblind. Please let me know if this helps clear up any confusion. The first attribute we're going to talk about is damage. In the horizontal axis, you'll see that the subclasses on the left side of the graph deal more DPS damage, while the subclasses on the right deal more burst damage. How far each subclass is up on the graph indicates how much damage they normally do compared to other classes. Traditionally, Marksmen, Battle Mages, Artillery Mages, Burst Mages, and Assassins deal the most damage in the game and are considered the primary damage dealers. Juggernauts and Skirmishers are slightly below these classes, but can still deal massive amounts of damage in the right hands. Divers are directly beneath Juggernauts and Skirmishers and can deal as much damage as those classes if they build glass cannon, but divers typically build more tanky. Catchers are kind of weird when it comes to damage. Some catchers do virtually no damage, and some catchers do massive amounts of damage. Typically, the catchers who do a lot of damage are very squishy, and the catchers who don't do a lot of damage have more tankiness or utility. Vanguards and Wardens are next on the damage chart. They aren't known for their damage, but they can be a damage threat if the battle continues on for long enough, since they mainly deal AoE DPS damage. At the bottom of the damage chart are the Enchanters. Enchanters have the lowest overall damage of any class in the game, but there are particular Enchanters who can deal a surprising amount of damage. Remember, this is the League of Damage, and that any class can deal a significant amount of damage if played accordingly. I've seen plenty of games where a Vanguard or a Warden or an Enchanter has hard carried and led our team in damage, so if damage is your number one priority, don't count out these classes that deal less damage just yet. The next attribute we're going to talk about is toughness. Subclasses that favor mitigation toughness are on the left, while subclasses that favor sustain are on the right. The subclasses with the most toughness are Wardens, Vanguards, Juggernauts, and some Battle Mages. Battle Mages are particularly difficult to characterize in regards to toughness because some Battle Mages are incredibly tanky, while others are quite fragile. Divers are right beneath these classes and can be just as tanky as the tank classes, depending on what items you get. Skirmishers are right below divers and are very hard to gauge in terms of toughness because their defenses are extremely situational and entirely dependent upon the skill of the player and the skill of his opponents. Beneath skirmishers, we have the catchers. Like I previously discussed, there are some squishy catchers and there are some more tanky catchers. Tanky catchers typically deal less damage than the squishy catchers. At the bottom we have Enchanters, Marksmen, Burst Mages, Artillery Mages, and Assassins. Enchanters and Marksmen can be deceptively tanky with their shields and their sustain, while Burst Mages, Artillery Mages, and Assassins possess hardly any forms of mitigation or sustain. For crowd control, we can see that the graph is greatly skewed towards hard crowd control. The kings and queens of crowd control are champions in the Catcher, Vanguard, and Warden classes. These classes typically have multiple forms of easy-to-hit crowd control that are extremely powerful. Immediately beneath them are the Enchanters, Divers, and Burst Mages who also possess significant crowd control. Underneath those classes, we have Battle Mages and Artillery Mages who typically have at least one form of crowd control, but whose crowd control is usually on a delay or is more difficult to hit. Beneath them, we have Assassins and Skirmishers. Assassins are one of the few classes that has more soft crowd control than hard crowd control, and Skirmishers have some potent stuns and knockups, but neither have great crowd control when compared to other classes. Marksmen and Juggernauts are extremely hard to classify when it comes to crowd control because the subclasses are extremely diverse. Some of these champions have soft crowd control, some have hard crowd control, and some have no crowd control. On the whole, Juggernauts have slightly more forms of crowd control than Marksmen, though. Next up, we have mobility. In this category, Assassins are far and away the most mobile champions, possessing significant engage and reposition mobility. However, Divers and Skirmishers also have amazing mobility. Divers have great engage mobility, and Skirmishers have great reposition mobility. Vanguards are slightly beneath Divers because they typically only have one form of engage mobility, usually on a longer cooldown. The difference is that Vanguard engages are usually monumental teamfight turning events. Wardens have slightly less engage potential than Vanguards, but usually have better utility. Catchers, like in many other categories, are all over the map in terms of mobility. Some catchers have great mobility, others not so much. Next, we have Burst Mages and Marksmen. There are certain champions within both of these classes that are very mobile, but most champions within these classes are not mobile at all. At the bottom, we have Battle Mages, Enchanters, Artillery Mages, and Juggernauts, who have some of the lowest mobility in the game. And finally, we have Utility. As you can see, most champions with utility have defensive utility, though there are a few champions in the game with offensive utility. In this attribute, Enchanters are hands down the undisputed champions. Directly beneath them are the Wardens, who sacrifice some utility for increased tankiness. Catchers are next in terms of utility, but they have significantly less utility than Enchanters and Wardens. There are a few champions within the Marksman, Burst Mage, Vanguard, Battle Mage, and Skirmisher classes that have some utility, which is why these classes aren't at the bottom, but most champions within these classes don't possess any utility. Juggernauts, Divers, Artillery Mages, and Assassins all don't possess any forms of utility. Another aspect we really haven't talked about is the concept of range, or where champions of particular subclasses should be positioned in fights. Here's a simple graphic showing the typical classes that make up the front, mid, and back lines of teams. In case it isn't obvious, the black E stands for the enemy team. The front line is made up of champions in the Diver, Vanguard, and Juggernaut classes. These are some of the tankiest champions in the game. Divers and Vanguards are great for initiating fights, and Juggernauts are great for counter-engage. The midline consists of Catchers, Wardens, and Battle Mages. Catchers are great at starting fights, but they're typically less tanky than Divers and Vanguards, so they tend to stay a bit further back. Wardens are just as tanky as Divers and Vanguards, but they stay further back because their job is frequently to peel for their backline rather to engage onto the enemy team. Battle Mages are also midline champions because they typically have shorter ranges than the backline champions. Off to the sides of the midlines, I have Assassins and Skirmishers. The reason why these classes are separated is because they're usually better in a side lane or in a flanking position rather than grouping with the team. Assassins and Skirmishers excel in picking off lone opponents, so they frequently push the side lanes and then hide in the fog of war to jump onto unsuspecting victims who come to clear the wave. Juggernauts are also great split pushers and may not group with the team, but they don't have the same flanking potential of Assassins and Skirmishers. The backline consists of Enchanters, Marksmen, Burst Mages, and Artillery Mages. Artillery Mages are slightly behind the other three classes because they have the longest ranges in the game. Marksmen, Burst Mages, and Artillery Mages are the primary ways the teams deal damage from range, so they want to be as far away from the enemy team as possible. Enchanters also typically stay in the backline because they excel in peeling for their squishy carries. Alright, so now that we've gone through the 5 attributes, you should have at least one subclass that matches all of your desired attributes. For example, my favorite memories of League are when I make a shot call to look for a team fight, and my decisiveness results in us smashing the enemy team and either getting a crucial objective like Baron or outright winning the game. My favorite heroes in movies, books, and video games are the fearless warriors who charge into battle even when the odds are against them. I like to engage, I like to be tanky, and I like to have some hard crowd control with at least a little bit of damage. Based on my responses, Divers or Vanguards would be a good choice for me. You may not have a class that 100% matches what you're looking for, but you should have at least one class that checks most of your boxes. If you're still confused and you haven't figured out which classes you like, just sit tight. I'm going to go through each of the classes and kind of highlight the pros and cons of each class. I'm also going to go through each subclass and really dig into what makes them special and discuss how each champion with each subclass is unique. We're also going to cover how different classes blend together and show you what champions are most similar between each of the classes. At the end, we'll spend a decent amount of time talking about marksmen and specialists, since they're kind of the oddballs of the bunch. If at the end of it all you still have no idea what champions interest you, please leave a comment with your attribute priorities and I'll try to help you out. Each champion is going to have a colored border around their picture, which lets you know what type of damage they primarily deal. Red bordered champions deal primarily physical damage. Blue bordered champions primarily deal magic damage. Yellow and green bordered champions deal both physical and magic damage, with yellow bordered champions more commonly deal a majority of their damage as physical damage, and green bordered champions more commonly dealing a majority of their damage as magic damage. What color border a champion has is not my personal opinion. It is based on statistical data from millions of games. I've also received feedback that my video was a little confusing for beginners who couldn't identify all of the champions based on their picture. To remedy this, I've included the champion's name below each of their pictures. Finally, we'll be talking a little bit about team compositions and what classes work best with each team composition. So if you haven't seen my team compositions video yet, I highly recommend that you check it out. First up, we have the Assassins. Assassins are a terrifying combination of mobility and burst damage that strikes fear into pretty much every squishy champion in the game. When ahead, Assassins can feel unstoppable. When behind, though, they can feel useless. They are extremely high-risk, high-reward champions. While Assassins have extremely high damage and high mobility, they have very little crowd control, utility, or toughness. Assassins are most commonly played in the mid lane or in the jungle, though a few Assassins can be played in top lane in certain matchups. Assassins thrive in catch compositions and split compositions. They can also work in attack compositions if played patiently, but Assassins tend to struggle to find effectiveness and protect in siege compositions. Assassins are truly defined by how they engage their victims and escape once they've secured the kill. In general, there are 3 ways that Assassins accomplish their goals: stealth, mobility, and evasiveness. Stealth comes in 2 forms, camouflage and invisibility. Camouflage, also called strategic stealth, is long-term stealth that renders the target undetectable as long as there aren't any enemy champions or vision wards close by. Camouflage is basically out-of-combat stealth. Invisibility, or tactical stealth, is an in-combat stealth which typically only lasts for a second or 2 but can only be defeated by turrets or truce sight. Assassins with a form of stealth are Evelynn, Shaco, Kha'Zix, Talon, and Akali. Mobility is just what it sounds like, ways for the enemy champions to gap close or traverse walls quickly. Every assassin has some form of mobility, but champions like Kassadin and Katarina only have mobility, and thus their mobility is on much lower cooldowns than other champions. Evasiveness is basically the ability for a champion to become untargetable for a brief moment, allowing them to dodge potent, damaging, or crowd control abilities. Assassins with evasiveness are Evelynn, Shaco, Akali, Zed, and Fizz. Assassins are most similar to the Catcher, Burst Mage, Diver, and Skirmisher classes. Hybrid stealth evasion assassins like Shaco and Evelynn have a lot in common with the damage and mobility catchers like Pyke, with the major difference between the classes being the catchers have much stronger forms of crowd control, while assassins have much more reliable escapes and burst damage. Mobility assassins like Talon and Kassadin have a lot in common with the mobility burst mages like Ahri and LeBlanc, with the primary difference being that assassins have more mobility, but burst mages have more range. Divers also have a lot in common with mobility assassins, with Rengar being very similar to Kha'Zix, and Wukong and Diana being very similar to Katarina. The big difference between assassins and divers is that assassins have escapes, while divers have increased survivability and tankiness. Evasive assassins like Fizz and Zed have the most in common with hybrid mobility threat skirmishers like Echo, with the primary difference being that assassins rely on momentary invulnerability, while skirmishers rely on powerful conditional defenses. Next up are the Skirmishers. Skirmishers are unparalleled duelists. They have very high damage and good mobility, which allows them to frequently reposition in a fight. The downside to Skirmishers is they aren't normally very tanky, they have low utility, and their abilities are often very skill dependent. Skirmishers are most commonly played in top lane and jungle, though recently we've seen an increase in certain Skirmishers being played in mid lane as well. Skirmishers are unparalleled split pushers and excel in split push compositions. They can also function well in catch compositions, and some Skirmishers can be dominant in attack compositions. Some protect compositions can also be built around Skirmishers, but in general they struggle in protect compositions and they also struggle in siege compositions. However, what really defines Skirmishers are their conditional defenses. Every Skirmisher has at least one ability which, when used properly, can make them feel extremely difficult to kill. However, if you use that ability improperly, a Skirmisher can be killed very easily. The 3 forms of conditional defenses that Skirmishers have are mobility, durability, and threat. Special shout out to Crit Keeper for an excellent post on these different forms of conditional defenses and what makes a skirmisher a skirmisher. I've included a link to Crit Keeper's post in the video description below. Mobility can take the form of crowd control reduction or removal, dashes, blinks, movement speed boosts, or anything else that makes a skirmisher more difficult to crowd control or hit with skill shots. Durability includes things such as shields, heals, invulnerability, bonus resistances, or anything else that makes skirmishers extremely difficult to burst down or kill. Threat includes things such as AoE damage, crowd control, or massive effects that can single-handedly win a fight. All skirmishers possess at least a little bit of each of these three conditional defenses, but each skirmisher has each conditional defense in different amounts. The skirmishers who rely primarily on mobility are Master Yi, Riven, and Irelia. The skirmishers who primarily rely on tankiness are Tryndamere, Jax, and Kled. The skirmishers who rely primarily on threat are Echo and Fiora. Yasuo has about equal amounts of mobility, durability, and threat, so he's in the middle. Skirmishers have the most in common with assassins, divers, and juggernauts. Evasion assassins like Zed and Fizz have the most in common with hybrid mobility threat skirmishers like Echo, with the primary difference being that assassins rely on invulnerability, while skirmishers rely on powerful conditional defenses. Divers have a lot in common with mobility and durability skirmishers. Renekton has a lot in common with Riven and Kled, while Camille has a lot in common with Irelia, Tryndamere, and Jax. The primary difference between divers and skirmishers is skirmishers have their conditional defenses, while divers have much more conventional defenses like health boosts, shields, or healing. Skirmishers also have more target agnostic damage, while divers have abilities that allow them to access the backline easier. Juggernauts have a lot in common with the durability and threat skirmishers, with Yorick and Alawi having the most in common with Kled and Fiora. The huge difference between skirmishers and juggernauts is that skirmishers have very strong damage with conditional defenses, and juggernauts have very strong defenses with conditional damage. One of my viewers came to this epiphany in my last video, but for the life of me, I cannot find their comment to properly thank them. So if you made this comment on my last video, please link me that comment so I can properly thank you again. Let's move on to the fighter class and first talk about divers. Divers at their core are jack of all trades. They have damage, they have tankiness, they have crowd control, and they have mobility. The true strength of divers is that they're extremely versatile and they can adapt their build for whatever their team needs or for whatever best counters the enemy team. Most divers are also very beginner friendly, though there are a few that are extremely difficult to play. The downside of divers is while they're the jack of all trades, they're also the master of none. There is no one area where they're the best at. This means that there are often other champions that can outshine them in every area. Divers also have very low utility. Divers are most commonly played in the jungle and top lane, but there are a few divers who can also be played in mid lane as well. Divers excel in catch and attack compositions, and there are a few divers that can be very strong in split push compositions or protect compositions. Divers usually aren't the best choice for siege compositions since they have low range and they typically aren't very good at peeling. Divers are really separated by what kind of damage they deal and what kind of toughness they have. First off, I want to say that all divers can deal a ton of burst damage if they build glass cannon. How a champion is built doesn't determine whether they're on the combo side or the attack side though. What determines what side a diver falls on is based on their kit. On the top side, we have the divers who favor comboing all of their abilities together as rapidly as possible. On the bottom side, we have the divers that are more attack-based, meaning they frequently weave in auto-attacks between abilities or are more auto-attack focused. On the left side, we have the divers who favor mitigation toughness, and on the right side, we have the divers who favor sustained toughness. Divers who favor combo and mitigation are Pantheon, Diana, Wukong, and Lee Sin. Divers who favor combo and sustain are Rengar, Renekton, Rek'Sai, and Hecarim. Divers who favor attack and mitigation are Jarvan, Nocturne, and Vi, and divers who favor attack and sustain are Camille, Warwick, and Xin Zhao. Divers have the most in common with Vanguards, Assassins, Skirmishers, and Juggernauts. The mitigation attack divers like Jarvan and Vi are most similar to isolate Vanguards like Sejuani and Nautilus, with the primary difference being that divers have more single target damage while Vanguards have more AoE damage. The combo mitigation divers like Wukong and Diana are most similar to the mobility assassins like Katarina, with the primary difference being that assassins have escapes while divers have increased durability. The combo Sustain Divers can also be similar to Assassins, with Rengar being most similar to Kazakhs. The combo Sustain Divers are also very similar to Mobility and Durability Skirmishers, with Renekton being most similar to Riven and Kled. The Sustain Attack Divers are similar to both the Durability Skirmishers and the Freight Train Juggernauts. Camille is most similar to Irelia, Tryndamere, and Jax of the Skirmisher class, while Warwick and Xin Zhao are most similar to Skarner, Olaf, and Shyvana of the Juggernaut class. The primary difference between Divers and Skirmishers is Skirmishers have their conditional defenses, while Divers have more conventional defenses like health boosts, shields, or heals. Divers are also designed to be able to reach the backline rather effortlessly with either targeted or long-range dashes. Skirmishers typically have shorter range dash abilities and have very target-agnostic damage, meaning they can cut through tanks and squishy targets alike. Ananagun made a very good post about Skirmishers and Divers, which I'll link below if you're interested. The primary difference between Divers and Juggernauts is that Divers have both a dash and hard crowd control, while Juggernauts usually only have one or the other or neither. This makes it easier for Divers to start fights, but Juggernauts usually have either more damage or more tankiness than Divers. Next, we're going to talk about the Juggernauts. Put bluntly, Juggernauts are the 1v2, 1v3, even 1v5 kings. They have very high tankiness with conditional damage that can be extremely strong. This combination makes them extremely good duelists, and if they can land their damaging abilities consistently, they can win even unfair fights. However, Juggernauts lack a lot of mobility, crowd control, and utility, which makes them very vulnerable to kiting. Juggernauts love it when enemy teams engage onto them, but they struggle against teams that can poke them from range or keep them away from high priority targets. Juggernauts are most commonly played in top lane and jungle, though we have seen a few Juggernauts played in mid lane and bot lane as well. Juggernauts can do decently well in pretty much any team composition, but they excel in split and protect compositions because of how much of a threat presence they have. Special thanks to Dragonshay for a great job defining Juggernauts. I've linked his post in the video description below. There are two types of Juggernauts, raid bosses and freight trains. Raid bosses are shown on the top and freight trains are shown on the bottom. Within each type of Juggernaut, there are those who are more ability-based and there are those who are more attack-based. Ability-based champions are shown on the left, and attack-based champions are shown on the right. In the upper left are the raid bosses who rely on their abilities. These are the true titans of League, able to take on entire enemy teams by themselves if they use their abilities correctly. However, these Juggernauts are also some of the most immobile champions in the game, with very limited forms of crowd control. These Juggernauts are Alawi, Darius, Mordekaiser, and Urgot. In the upper right, we have the raid bosses who rely on their attacks. All of these raid bosses have spammable auto-attack augmentations on their Q, which is their primary source of damage and sustain. Each of these raid bosses synergize very well with Sheen items and can take down towers extremely quickly with their enhanced auto-attacks. They all have ultimates which make them even more fearsome in combat, allow them to turn the tide of a battle even when numbers aren't in their favor. These Juggernauts are Nasus, Yorick, and Trundle. In the bottom left are the freight trains who rely on their abilities. Each of these champions have ways of sticking to their target while they rapidly chip away at their health with either spammable spells or damage over time abilities. These freight trains have more crowd control and more mobility than their raid boss cousins, but they also have slightly lower damage and tankiness. These Juggernauts are Aatrox, Garen, Dr. Mundo, and Skarner. In the bottom right are the freight trains who rely on their attacks. These are the fastest moving of the Juggernauts and can shred through tanks and squishy champions alike with their brutal, rapid attacks. These Juggernauts are Volibear, Olaf, Udyr, and Shyvana. Juggernauts have the most in common with the Skirmisher, Warden, Diver, and Battle Mage classes. Threat and toughness skirmishers like Fiora and Kled have the most in common with raid boss Juggernauts like Alawi and Yorick, since they both can be extremely difficult to bring down and often have abilities that can single-handedly swing team fights if used properly. As previously discussed, the primary difference between Skirmishers and Juggernauts is Skirmishers have strong damage with conditional defenses, while Juggernauts have strong defenses with conditional damage. The Protect Wardens like Tahm Kench and Shen have the most in common with the Attack Juggernauts like Trundle and Volibear. Both of these classes have strong auto-attacks with enhanced damage. Wardens typically have more utility than Juggernauts, while Juggernauts typically are better duelists and split pushers. The freight train Juggernauts like Skarner, Olaf, and Shyvana have the most in common with the sustained DPS divers like Warwick and Zhao. Both can stick onto their target very well and deal a frightening amount of damage if they aren't focused. The primary difference between the Juggernauts and the divers is divers have both long-range dashes and hard crowd control, while Juggernauts usually only have one or the other or neither. Juggernauts typically are a bit tankier and deal more damage though. Finally, the ability-based Juggernauts like Darius and Aatrox have the most in common with the tanky battle mages like Vladimir and Swain. Both can survive for insanely long periods of time with the ridiculous sustain they can gain from proper use of their abilities. However, battle mages typically have longer range than Juggernauts, but Juggernauts have increased survivability. Now we're going to move on to the tank classes, and the first tank class we're going to talk about is the Vanguards. Vanguards thrive on chaos and excel in the thick of a team fight. What makes Vanguards unique is their terrifying amounts of AoE crowd control and AoE damage. Vanguards overall also have some of the best engage in the game, making them ideal to start fights when things are optimal for their team. While Vanguards do deal AoE damage, in general their damage is far less than other classes. However, since Vanguards can survive for so long, they can still put up respectable damage numbers. Vanguards also don't have a lot of utility. They're great at CCing enemies, but they aren't the best at helping allies. Vanguards are most commonly played in jungle, top, and support, and do extremely well in attack and catch compositions. Vanguards can also be useful in protect compositions since they can use their crowd control as peel. Vanguards tend to struggle in siege and split push compositions since their utility and disengage isn't as good as some of the other classes. Vanguards are really defined by how they use their crowd control and initiate into team fights. There are three types of Vanguards: Wombo, Flank, and Isolate. Wombo Vanguards are known for their terrifying AoE crowd control ultimates that can engulf entire teams and set up the ultimates of other champions. They typically have extremely long-range engages that allow them to get into the heart of the enemy team before unleashing their mayhem. The Wombo Vanguards are Amumu, Malphite, Zac, and Leona. Flank Vanguards are those who excel at hitting the teams from the side or behind. Their abilities are great at cutting off retreat paths and splitting the enemy team up, allowing you to pick off stragglers. The Flank Vanguards are Ornn, Sion, Maokai, and Rammus. Isolated Vanguards specialize on jumping onto a single target and CCing them for what feels like an eternity, forcing the enemy team to either leave them for dead or risk being aced. The Isolated Vanguards are Sejuani, Alistar, Nautilus, and Gragas. Vanguards have the most in common with the Catcher, Warden, and Diver classes. Wombo Vanguards like Malphite and Zac have the most in common with the mobility catchers like Rakan. Both have great engage, but Vanguards have increased tankiness and catchers have increased utility. Flank Vanguards like Ornn, Sion, and Maokai have the most in common with engage Wardens like Galio and Poppy. Both can completely disrupt team fights with their AoE damage and crowd control, but Vanguards typically have more reliable engage, while Vanguards have better counter-engage and utility. Isolated Vanguards like Sejuani and Nautilus have the most in common with the mitigation DPS divers like Jarvan and Vi. Both are amazing at locking down targets, but divers typically have more damage, while Vanguards have more tankiness. The second tank class is the Wardens. Wardens are unique because of their combination of tankiness, crowd control, and utility. Wardens also have strong disengage capabilities and are masters at protecting their allies. Wardens typically have lower damage than a lot of other classes, and their engage capability is often situational, making them better suited to be follow-up engage or counter-engage. Wardens are most commonly played support and top, though a few Wardens can also be played jungle and mid. Wardens are very well rounded, which allows them to function decently well in all types of team compositions. However, they really shine in protect and siege compositions. There are three traits which make Wardens unique: protection, control, and engage. Protection Wardens specialize in keeping allies alive with abilities to either make their allies immune to damage or grant them shields or increased resistances. Taric, Tahm Kench, Shen, and Braum are all examples of protection Wardens. Control Wardens are great at altering the battlefield with large AoE abilities to prevent enemies from even getting close to their allies. Nunu, Braum, Galio, and Taric are all examples of Control Wardens. Engage Wardens possess more reliable forms of engage while still having decent utility. Poppy, Shen, and Galio are all examples of engage Wardens. Wardens have the most in common with Enchanters, Battle Mages, Vanguards, and Juggernauts. Protection and control Wardens like Tariq and Braum have the most in common with zoning Enchanters like Soraka and Janna. Both provide great protection and peeling capabilities for their carries, with Wardens having more tankiness and Enchanters having more utility. Control Wardens like Nunu and Galio have the most in common with AoE battle mages like Rumble and Anivia. Both can control the battlefield with massive AoE abilities, with Wardens having more tankiness and battle mages having more damage. Engage Wardens like Galio and Poppy have the most in common with the flank Vanguards like Maokai, Ornn, and Scion. Both can completely disrupt team fights with their AoE damage and crowd control, but Vanguards typically have more reliable engage, while Wardens have better counter engage and utility. Protection Wardens like Tahm Kench and Shen have the most in common with attack Juggernauts like Trundle and Volibear. Both of these classes have strong auto attacks with enhanced damage. Wardens typically have more utility than Juggernauts, while Juggernauts are typically better duelists and split pushers. We're now moving on to the controllers, and the first subclass we're going to talk about are the catchers. Catchers really are all about crowd control. They have some of the craziest crowd control in the game, and they're phenomenal at enabling their team to get picks. Catchers also tend to have some decent utility, and quite a few of them can do surprising damage. The cons of catchers is they're usually very squishy, and they're also very skill shot reliant. If you miss your skill shot on a catcher, then you're pretty much useless to your team. Catchers are most commonly played support, but a few catchers can also be played mid or jungle. Shockingly, catchers are amazing in catch compositions. They can also be very good in a siege and attack compositions, since their crowd control is great at setting up poke or starting fights. Because catchers have some utility, they can also be decent in protect compositions as well. Catchers tend to struggle in split push compositions because they don't have significant split push capability or disengage. On top of their crowd control, catchers have three other things that make them unique: utility, mobility, and damage. Utility catchers have powerful ways of saving allies in addition to their powerful crowd control, which can doom enemies. Ivern, Thresh, Rakan, Bard, and Morgana are all examples of utility catchers. Mobility catchers possess increased mobility in the form of dashes or movement speed boosts, which allow them to easier set up their crowd control or escape when a team fight goes sideways. Examples of mobility catchers are Rakan, Bard, Blitzcrank, and Pyke. Damage catchers are a frightening blend of damage and crowd control, allowing them to not only set up the kills, but secure them as well. Examples of damage catchers are Nico, Pyke, Zyra, Bard, Morgana, and Blitzcrank. Catchers have the most in common with the Enchanter, Vanguard, Assassin, and Burst Mage classes. Utility catchers like Ivern and Morgana have the most in common with the Poke Enchanters like Sona and Karma. Both have tons of utility, with catchers having better crowd control and Enchanters having a bit more reliable poke damage. Mobility catchers like Rakan have the most in common with the Wombo Vanguards like Malphite and Zac. Catchers have more utility, while Vanguards are much tankier. Damage mobility catchers like Pyke have the most in common with assassins like Shaco and Evelyn, with the major difference between the classes being that catchers have much stronger forms of crowd control, while assassins have more reliable escapes and burst damage. Damage catchers such as Morgana, Nico, and Zyra have the most in common with the lockdown burst mages like Annie and Twisted Fate. Catchers typically have longer range or longer lasting crowd control, as well as more utility, while burst mages are more purely focused on damage. The second controller class that we're going to talk about are the Enchanters. Enchanters have the best utility and disengage in the game. Overall, Enchanters are amazing at keeping their allies alive. While many classes are the masters of death, Enchanters are the masters of life, and their ability to keep their squishy damage dealers alive can single-handedly win a team fight. Enchanters also have decent amounts of crowd control and potent poke damage. The downsides of Enchanters is they're typically low damage, low toughness, and not very mobile. Enchanters are most commonly played support, but a few can also be played in mid lane. Because Enchanters have such great disengage, they excel in protect, poke, and split push compositions. However, since their engage capabilities are typically poor, they tend to struggle in attack and catch compositions. Enchanters are broken down based on whether they're better at poking or zoning, and whether they're more focused on healing or shielding. Zoning Enchanters are great at controlling space and shutting down engages, while poking Enchanters are better at dissuading fights by chipping down enemy health. The zoning and healing Enchanters are Soraka and Nami. The only zoning and shielding enchanter is Janna. The only healing and poking enchanter is Sona, and the poking and shielding enchanters are Lulu and Karma. Enchanters have the most in common with the Warden and Catcher classes. Zoning enchanters like Soraka and Janna have the most in common with the protection and control wardens like Taric and Braum. Both provide great protection and peeling capabilities for their carries, with wardens having more tankiness and enchanters having more utility. Poking enchanters like Sona and Karma have the most in common with the utility catchers like Ivern and Morgana. Both have tons of utility, with catchers having better crowd control and enchanters having a bit more reliable poke damage. Alright, so we're going to move on to the mage classes, and I'm going to talk about both the burst mages and the artillery mages together, since they both fulfill a lot of the same niches. Burst mages have high burst, good crowd control, and decent range. Their play pattern is to land their crowd control ability and then unleash their full combo to kill an enemy in a single spell rotation. However, burst mages have low toughness, situational mobility, and low utility. Burst mages are most commonly played in mid lane, but some can be played as support. They excel the most in catch compositions, but they can also be extremely successful in attack and siege compositions. Burst mages tend to struggle in protect and split push compositions. Artillery mages tend to have slightly lower burst damage than burst mages, but their poking abilities are typically on a slightly shorter cooldown, allowing them to have slightly higher DPS. Artillery mages have less reliable crowd control than burst mages, but artillery mages have longer range than burst mages. Like burst mages, artillery mages have low toughness and low utility. They are typically even more immobile than burst mages and are extremely reliant on their skill shots. Like burst mages, artillery mages are most commonly played in mid lane, though they can also be played as support. Because of their increased range, artillery mages are best in siege compositions and are arguably one of the best classes in the game in siege compositions. Because they share a lot in common with burst mages, artillery mages can also be successful in attack compositions and catch compositions, and just like burst mages, they tend to struggle in protect and split push compositions. So really, the pros to burst mages is higher burst and either greater mobility or easier to hit crowd control, while the pros to artillery mages is longer range and more consistent DPS. There are three types of burst mages: mobility, lockdown, and AoE. The artillery mages share a lot in common with the AoE burst mages, so I've included them in the graphic as well. I've also arranged the champions based on their range, with the shortest range champions being near the center and the longest range champions being near the edges. Mobility burst mages are great at picking off single targets, but have less reliable crowd control and less AoE damage than other burst mages. The mobility burst mages are Ahri, LeBlanc, and Zoe. The lockdown burst mages have the most reliable crowd control of the burst mages. Their crowd control is either point and click or has a massive AoE that is relatively easy to hit. The lockdown burst mages are Twisted Fate, Annie, Vigar, and Syndra. The AoE burst mages have the best AoE damage of the burst mages. These burst mages are the best team fighters among the burst mages, but don't have as much pick potential as the mobility or lockdown burst mages. The AoE burst mages are Brand, Orianna, and Lux, along with the artillery mages who are Ziggs, Xerath, and Vel'Koz. Burst mages are most similar to assassins, catchers, and battle mages. Mobility burst mages like Ahri and LeBlanc have the most in common with the mobility assassins like Talon and Kassadin. The primary difference is burst mages have longer range and more reliable crowd control, while assassins have better escapes and more reliable burst damage. Lockdown burst mages like Twisted Fate and Annie have the most in common with damage catchers like Morgana, Zyra, and Nico. Burst mages are typically more focused on damage, while catchers are more focused on crowd control. AoE burst mages like Brand and Orianna have the most in common with battle mages like Victor and Talia. The primary difference is battle mages typically have better zone control and better defensive capabilities, while burst mages focus on more raw damage. Final mage subclass are the battle mages. This is a really diverse class, but what defines them as a whole is their shorter range and their massive DPS damage. Battle mages are great at controlling areas of the battlefield, having potent threat areas that allow them to kill anyone foolish enough to enter. Battle mages also have good crowd control and typically have some type of defense that helps keep them alive longer than a normal mage. However, they are considerably less mobile than other champions, and they don't have much utility. This combined with their shorter range means that they struggle against poking and kiting compositions or compositions that have a lot of crowd control. Battle mages are typically either played in mid lane or top lane. Because of a battle mage's diversity, they can be played in pretty much every type of team composition, though their battlefield control makes them especially good in attack compositions and protect compositions. There are 3 types of battle mages: tanky, focused, and AoE. Tanky battle mages like Swain and Vladimir have unparalleled sustain and love to be in the center of a team fight. While they may not build purely defensive items, they can survive much longer than other mages. Focus mages are those who deal high DPS to a single target. This can be from damage over time spells like Malzahar or from machine gun casters who spam spells like Rise and Cassiopeia. Finally, we have the AoE battle mages. These champions deal massive amounts of AoE damage, but generally have less tankiness than the tanky battle mages and less single target DPS than the focused battle mages. The champions who fall under this sector are Rumble, Victor, Aurelion Sol, Anivia, and Talia. In the center, we have Karthus, who has a little bit of everything. He's a machine gun caster like Rise and Cassiopeia, but his spammable spell is AoE, and all of his other abilities are AoE. And while he isn't as tanky as Vladimir or Swain, he excels at being at the center of a team fight thanks to his passive. Battle mages have the most in common with Juggernauts, Marksmen, Burst mages, and Wardens. Tanky battle mages like Swain and Vladimir have the most in common with the ability-based Juggernauts like Darius and Aatrox. Battle mages have longer ranges than Juggernauts, but typically aren't as tanky as them. Focused battle mages like Rise and Cassiopeia have most in common with hypercarry marksmen like Kai'Sa and Kog'Maw. The main difference is that battle mages rely on their machine gun spells, while marksmen are more auto-attack focused. AoE battle mages like Victor and Talia have the most in common with burst mages like Brand and Orianna, while other AoE battle mages like Rumble and Anivia have the most in common with control wardens like Nunu and Galio. Wardens are more tanky than battle mages, but battle mages have higher damage. However, when compared to burst mages, battle mages typically have better zone control and better defensive capabilities, while burst mages are more focused on raw damage. Alright, let's now talk about the Marksmen. Marksmen are the largest class in the game and arguably the most diverse class in all of League of Legends. What ultimately defines a marksman, though, is their ability to do consistent DPS from range. However, marksmen vary widely in how much range, mobility, sustain, crowd control, and utility they have. If you remember earlier in the video, I said that marksmen were so diverse that they could have their own spectrum. I wasn't lying. On the screen you can see which class each marksman is most like. In the center we have what you could call the quote-unquote pure marksmen, or the marksmen who are unlike any of the other classes. These are what people stereotypically think of when they think of a marksman. Long range, auto-attack based, with great wave clear team fighting and tower taking. These marksmen are Tristana, Xayah, Jinx, and Caitlyn. In the upper left we have Twitch, Vayne, and Kai'Sa, who are most common to assassins, though in many ways Vayne is also similar to a skirmisher thanks to her insane dueling power, and Kai'Sa has a bit of a diver style of play thanks to the long range engage on her ultimate and the shield on her ultimate. These are the only marksmen with stealth, Twitch possessing camouflage and Vayne and Kai'Sa possessing invisibility. When a fed Twitch, Vayne, or Kai'Sa is in the game, you have to completely change how you play, just like you would have to if there was a fed assassin in the game. Any brush could hide certain death, and anytime you push a lane alone, you're risking your life. Beneath them are the marksmen who are most similar to the skirmishers, Callista, Lucian, and Draven. These are the dueling marksmen. Each of these marksmen have a strong laning phase, and they snowball very hard in the mid-game thanks to their high damage output and mobility. However, due to their reduced range, they often struggle in late-game team fights. Additionally, if they don't snowball early, then they often get outscaled by many other marksmen. On the left, we have Jhin and Misfortune, who are most similar to the burst mages. These marksmen can chunk you for half your health with a single attack or ability, but they lack the sustained DPS of other marksmen. They're great against squishy teams, but they struggle against teams with a lot of tanks and engage. On the lower left, we have Corki and Ezreal, who are closest to the artillery mages. Both these marksmen have long range, spammable abilities that are extremely skill shot reliant. However, they lack the crowd control like true artillery mages, but they do have increased mobility. Directly above them is Kog'Maw, who is an interesting blend of artillery mage, battle mage, and marksman. His ultimate gives him artillery mage poke along with his insane auto attack range when his W is activated. He's also similar to a battle mage because Kog'Maw outputs some of the highest DPS in the game if you stand within his threat zone. I don't care who you are, a late game Kog'Maw will kill you if you don't immediately crowd control and kill him first. To the right, we have Kindred, who is most closely associated with the Enchanter class thanks to her crowd control and her powerful, death-defying ultimate. Beneath Kindred, we have Sivir, who has some potent utility in the form of her ultimate and great self-peel in the form of her shield. Finally, we have the Marksmen, who are closest to the catchers, Varus and Ashe. Ashe is a quintessential utility marksman with amazing crowd control on her ultimate and W, and amazing utility on her E. Varus is also an extremely versatile marksman since he can build lethality and act more like an artillery mage, or he can build more attack speed and on-hit damage and play more like a traditional marksman. Which build is most popular depends on the meta and the current strength of each build at that moment in time. One thing people often overlook though is how powerful his ultimate is, giving him his rightful place next to Ashe as one of the marksmen who are closest to the catcher class. This brings us to our final class, the specialists, the oddballs, and the unique play styles. Regardless of what you call them, these guys are the redheaded stepchildren of League, but they probably think of themselves as the champions who are too cool to be part of any class or subclass. Each of these champions have very, very different play styles than other champions, and traditionally require a lot of experience to be played competently. Like marksmen, specialists are so diverse that they could have their own spectrum. At the top, Kayn is a combination of assassin and diver, leaning more towards the diver side when he transforms into Rost, and more to the assassin side when he transforms into Shadow Assassin. Directly beneath him is Elise, who feels more like a catcher in her human form, and more like an assassin or a diver in her spider form. Moving left, Graves and Quinn are a combination of skirmisher and marksman, possessing terrifying dueling capabilities while simultaneously being ranged. Gangplank is a combination of skirmisher and battle mage, possessing amazing late game scaling and absolutely insane AoE damage. Jace is a combination of skirmisher and artillery mage, possessing the range of an artillery mage in cannon form and the dueling power of a skirmisher in hammer form. Nidalee is a combination of assassin and artillery mage, possessing the range of an artillery mage in human form and the mobility and burst damage of an assassin in cougar form. Kennen and Azir both possess battle mage and marksman properties, though Kennen leans more towards battle mage with his iconic ultimate, and Azir leans more towards marksman with his auto attack focused kit. Teemo is closest to the marksman class, but his kit also has aspect of battle mage thanks to his damage over time abilities and his zone control. He's also pure evil, so I just stay away from him if you value your soul. Lysandra is another champion that tends to defy placement. She's no doubt a mage, but she shares a lot in common with both burst mages and battle mages, but her playstyle is completely her own. Fiddlesticks and Heimerdinger are two of the most unique champions in the game. They really aren't like any class, but if I had to place them somewhere, I'd say they're closest to battle mages. Both have shorter ranges, but amazing kill potential if enemies enter their threat zone. Zillion is another weird one. He's part battle mage, part enchanter, and part catcher. His bombs give him the zone control of a battle mage, while his speed up and revive give him the utility of an enchanter, and his slow and his bombs give him the catch potential of a catcher. Kayle is a really interesting combination of damage and utility, making her kind of a hybrid marksman and enchanter. Her kit is very enchanter focused with a slow, a heal, a movement speed boost, and invulnerability in her ultimate, but her E allows her to also deal massive damage with her auto attacks once she gets a few items. Gnar is another transforming champion who is a combination of two classes. In this case, he's a marksman when he's in mini form, but he's a vanguard when he's in mega form. He's the only champion in the game with this squishy, tanky duality. Finally, we have Singed and Cho'Gath. These champions are kind of part tank, part juggernaut, but they don't really fit into either class. Singed is a hyper-fast, DPS-based tank who wins by relentlessly split pushing and annoying the enemy team so much that they chase him and waste time and resources trying to kill him. Cho'Gath is a giant, slow, lumbering void monster that can chomp you for over 1,000 true damage if you get too close, and who also possesses one of the most powerful crowd controls in the game, an AoE silence. And that's it. We're done with all of the classes. Hopefully by this point you've found at least a few champions that have piqued your interest. And if you still don't know what subclass is right for you, leave a comment with your priorities and I'll try to help you out. I know at least a few of you have been wondering if I could take all of the subclass diagrams and turn them into a single large diagram that's even more accurate than the pentagon diagram. The answer is sort of. Here's how all the classes really connect together. It isn't near as pretty as the other diagram, but it is more accurate. I'd love to eventually turn this into a 3D model, so if you know of any 3D modeling software that might work, let me know and I'll be happy to check it out. If you're still here and you've watched the entire video, then I applaud you. I do plan on doing some more class-specific and champion-specific videos in the future, so if you have a particular class or champion that is your favorite, let me know why I should do a video featuring that class or champion next. Also, I do want to start making tools that can help players out, and my Subclass Calculator is my first attempt at this. So if you've tried out the calculator that I've listed in the video description below, let me know what you did or did not like about it. This video took a lot of time to create, so if you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button. And if you made it this far, why not subscribe to the channel? I try to put out high quality content like this as often as I can, and I do my best to answer as many questions as I can. Thank you to everyone who has supported me and the channel over the years, and a very special thank you to everyone who has helped me make this video or has written some of the articles that I've linked below. I hope you all have a fantastic day. This is Randomonium, signing off.